If you knew you only had a short time to live, how would you spend the last days of your life? Would you quit your job, give up all responsibility, live life to the hilt? Or knowing you were about to meet your Maker, would you decide to dedicate the remainder of your life to charity and service and kindness, just to be safe? Today we hear the final days of Jesus' life. The Passion narrative, as St. Luke relays it to us, is the longest of the 4 Gospels in the Bible. So we're not going to look at the entire Gospel from today. We're just going to look at 4 particular scenes. If you're following along with your homily shield, I'll give you the verses as we look at them. So the first scene is the Last Supper. Jesus, by this time in his life and ministry, knows that he is going to die. And so he gathers his friends together for one last meal. He offers them bread and wine as a way of remembering, for them to remember him. And then St. Luke tells us something very curious happens. We're at Luke chapter 22. This is verses 24 and 20 to 26. Then an argument broke out among the disciples about which of them should be regarded as the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are addressed as benefactors. But among you it shall not be so. Rather, the greatest among you must be as the youngest, and the leader as the servant." So picture this. Jesus knows he is about to die. He offers his friends bread and wine as a way to remember him. And the next thing that happens is they begin to argue among themselves over who is the greatest. Now, you can imagine with Jesus under the stress and pressure that he's experiencing, and the frustration that he has had with these disciples throughout his ministry, that he is about to say, "You guys just don't get it." And we would understand if he threw up his hands in frustration and simply walked to the garden saying, "Let's get this over with." But he doesn't do that. As he's done throughout his ministry, Jesus takes the time to teach his disciples. Even in the face of his own death, Jesus continues to minister to them. Eventually, they do end up in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus invites his disciples to pray with him. And yet, as we know, they fall asleep. And then at verses 47 to 51, Luke tells us this is what happens. While Jesus was still speaking to the disciples, a crowd approached, and in front was one of the 12, a man named Judas. He went up to Jesus to kiss him. Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" His disciples realized what was about to happen, and they asked, "Lord, shall we strike with a sword?" And one of them struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said in reply, "Stop, no more of this." Then he touched the servant's ear and healed him. Now, at this point in the story, Jesus knows that there's no way out. They have come to arrest him. They are going to bring him to the authorities, and he knows he will be executed. But rather than simply give in and let it take its course, in the midst of all the confusion and commotion, someone is hurt, and Jesus stops and heals them. Something that he had done countless times throughout his ministry, Jesus continues to do even in the face of his death. He is taken to Pilate, then he's sent to Herod, and then he's back sent to Pilate, where Pilate finally condemns him to death. He receives his cross, and even though he has the help of Simon of Cyrene, he has already been beaten and flogged. He is bleeding, he is weakening. And then Luke tells us at chapter 23, verses 27 to 31, a large crowd of people followed him, including many women who mourned and lamented him. Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep instead for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming when people will say, 'Blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' At that time people will say to the mountains, 'Fall upon us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if these things are done when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Jesus continues to be aware of those around him. He sees these women who are mourning and lamenting him. But rather than focus on himself, he reaches out to them. He shows care and respect to them. He preaches and he prophesies to them, just as he had done throughout his life, even in the face of his death. And finally, Jesus is nailed to the cross at verses 33 to 34, in which Luke tells us, "When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him, and the criminals there, one on his right, the other on his left. Then Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them. They know not what they do.'" And further along in the passage, after there's an exchange among Jesus and the two criminals on either side, Jesus says to the repentant thief, "Amen, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is just moments before Jesus breathes his last. He knows he is about to die in any moment. And yet, in these last moments, Jesus gives the final gift, the very reason he came for all of us. He gives the gift of forgiveness. Something that he had offered to many people along the journey of his ministry. In the face of his final moment, Jesus forgives. You see, throughout the story of Jesus' passion, St. Luke wants us to realize that Jesus faced his death in the same way that he faced his life. That throughout his passion, he continued to teach, to heal, to care, to forgive. When Jesus faced his death, he chose to love. Now, Luke's story of the Passion of Christ, though seemingly a story about death, is really a story about life. If our impending death were to incline us to give up all responsibility, to live carefree, to live it up, then we just might have to ask ourselves whether we are truly committed to what we are doing right here and now. Or if our impending death were to evoke a sudden conversion to generosity, care, and service to others, then we might just have to ask ourselves, what are we currently doing with our lives that these things aren't already a part of it? In fact, if knowledge of our impending death were to cause us to change our lives significantly, then why aren't we making those changes today? Because ready or not, folks, someday we are all going to die. So here's the last of our Lenten questions. If you knew you only had a short time to live, how would you spend the last days of your life? Amen.